Welcome to Clocked Out, a show for watch enthusiasts where we discuss the personal stories behind timepieces and reveal the significance they had to the wearer. Welcome back to an episode of Clocked Out, and today I am with a good friend at this point, Nino, and an avid watch collector of 9 years, and has a crazy collection, mostly of vintage watches, and he has brought the collection here today, a bunch of really cool pieces, and we're looking forward to the episode. So without further ado, Nino, welcome to the show.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm looking forward to kind of walking down memory lane with some of these pieces that I've collected over the years.
Before we even get into a specific piece, what is your earliest memory of watches for you?
I remember, I think I was maybe 10 years old, and I always loved watches as far as I can remember. And I remember that I had a Power Rangers watch at the time.
Nice.
That like flipped open, and there was like the time. And also, actually, no, there was a Ninja Turtle watch a couple years before.
Naturally.
And everybody loved the Ninja Turtles back in the day. So I think from that, the Power Rangers, and then my uncle, a few years later, I think I might have been 13 years old, went to Disney World and got me a Mickey Mouse watch with the hands. And I remember that was like iconic at the time.
Yeah.
So like each hand is kind of going each way. And I just was like enamored by that thing. And it's kind of funny because I lost it for so many years. And my sister actually like found it and gifted it to me about 4 years ago. And it was like crazy because all those memories came back. Yeah. And I put it on my wrist, and I didn't realize at the time, because back then it felt like it was normal size, but it was probably like 25 millimeters. It was like a tiny little, but something. You know, and I was like, you know, now it just kind of sits in a special place in my watch collection, just kind of bringing back all of those memories. Yeah. But yeah, it's been, and then of course I think like a lot of us, like I got into the Fossil and the Movado later on, and then the Bug bit. And I decided to kind of get serious one day when things were going well. You know, I was like, you know, looking down at the watch that I had at the time, like, you know what, I had a really good year at my job, and I'm like, you know what, I think it's time to kind of splurge and spoil myself, and kind of just started going down a rabbit hole of like, okay, what would be a good fit, first Swiss piece. And the crazy thing, and I had no idea at the time, I ran into like the Speedmaster, and at that time, that was about 9 years ago, I didn't know anything about the Speedmaster. I didn't know that it was iconic. Like, no, looking back on it, I just like, you know what, that's a really cool looking watch.
I'd like that.
And I was like, at that time, I'm like, you know, I was kind of going through just different posts, like Instagram, social media, and I was like, that's a cool looking watch, and that's how I ended up with this piece here.
First luxury piece.
Yeah, so like this one, it took, you know, I have a very kind of smaller wrist, hence kind of like my love for vintage. Yeah. And when I was looking at the Speedmaster, I decided, you know what, I'm going to go into the Omega boutique downtown and just kind of take a look at like what they look like. And it's kind of funny at that time, and I believe even in your last video, you had mentioned that we didn't think about size really back then when we were buying watches. And so I never took into consideration of why some watches might look better than others on my wrist. And now I know it was like not just the size of the diameter, but the lug to lug too, and how far it goes off of the wrist. And so I went to the Omega boutique and I was trying on their Speedmasters, and you know there were a lot of 40 millimeter and above models, and I was like, you know what, this is just, it's a shame because it just fits too big and just doesn't look right on my wrist. And I remember the salesman had a Speedmaster on a brown NATO, which now I have as well. And I remember thinking like, that just looks so cool. Yeah. And it's kind of crazy because I then found out about this model. It's called the Speedmaster Reduced. And so this model came out, you know, about 20 years ago, and it came in two versions. It came in the acrylic and the sapphire glass version. So at the time too, there's a lot of manual wind. Speedmaster's kind of staying true to you know what, you know, the original piece. And because it was my first piece, I really wasn't sure, am I gonna really manually wind this thing every other day or whatnot? So I was like, okay, I found this piece, 38 millimeter, it's automatic. put it on the wrist, and I went through like a local watch event, and I was able to try this on, and I was like, love at first sight.
Perfect.
So. Yeah.
They always say that you're not a collector until you have a Speedy, right?
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
Starting out strong right out of the gate there. So how long was the gap, I guess, between this, getting that bug back, and what is going to be our next piece?
Yeah, so it kind of really went down a rabbit hole. Then just started kind of consuming content, and you know how that goes. And then one leads to another, and it starts opening this door to all different types of pieces. So that was when I was about 29 years old, and I knew my 30th was coming up, and so I was like, another milestone, another excuse to get something for myself. And at that time, I really kind of wanted, for my 30th, it would be great if I can get my first Rolex. Like, I didn't really know a ton about the brand at the time. I did know that I liked, again, the vintage pieces. They were smaller, and I'm very methodical when I'm looking at pieces because, as you know, it's easy to be burned out there. So looking for the right seller, making sure that, the dial is correct and original to the watch. And I just couldn't find one. And then I kind of went through this phase where I was looking at some of these like the military and Arabic numeral watches, and I ended up finding this Tudor. So this is a 1946 Tudor caliber 59. And when I found that, I'm like, you know what? It's funny because even though I was looking for a Rolex and it has the Rolex buckle on it, it's in the same lineage, but I was like, you know what? This kind of hits the spot for me. I fell in love with it. Radium dial, patinaed like very nicely. And it has what they call Bombay lugs, and they're not polished whatsoever. And so, when looking for vintage pieces, you really want to make sure that you're not getting an overly polished case because it takes away all those clean lines. And so when I found that, I bought into the originalness of it and how clean it was. And so that was my next purchase. And ever since then, again, started kind of going down the rabbit hole even more. And I was like, kind of always on the lookout. I was like, what's going to be the Rolex purchase that I really wanted? It kind of scratched the itch, and it was great, and I still love it to this day. But I think as collectors, sometimes what I've learned is we're like maybe have our eyes set on one specific piece, and we might not find it, and we kind of get like a replacement piece, and it never fully scratches that itch, right?
Oh, yeah.
And then you kind of look down, and you're always like, this
not quite what I wanted.
Exactly.
No. It's
so like that's one thing. If we give advice to collectors is just like kind of hold out.
You'll make that mistake anyway.
Yeah, exactly. But hold out until you get the piece that you really long for, because if you're not fully enamored with it, it might not completely scratch the itch. And so while I love that watch, I was still looking for that my first like Rolex piece at the time. And so finally, I think about 7 months later after that, I ended up with this piece. And so this is a Rolex 1500. This is early 1970, and it has what they call a Mosaic Dial. So this is a dial that is created by silk. And what's really cool about it is that it patinaed. It was from Texas, and so it patinaed ever so lightly. So usually, originally, they're kind of dark blue, but this one kind of turned out to be this baby blue color, which I fell in love with. Yeah. And so this is 34 millimeter, and the date just 1601s are 36. And so at the time,
the most iconic
size. Yeah, exactly. And so I know 36, and so I was a little bit weary, like, okay, I know the Tudor was smaller. And, I was like, well, how will the 34 fit? And honestly, if anybody's ever wondering if the 34 is big enough, the oyster cases on these wear really well. So they do wear bigger than 34, but I know it scares off a lot of people. But the value in these is crazy. Like the price that like these go for versus the date just is like this is an amazing bang for your buck, and there's so many different dial variations.
The dial, I think, is the biggest thing. We were talking off screen about the date wheel even being patinas, which was pretty cool and interesting to see. So I was doing a little bit of research on this watch, and I wasn't able to see in my brief Google search any that had gold incorporated, or at least. And so let me know about the gold. And was this like a Rolex two-tone type deal?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you bring that up, because so this is a 14 karat gold bezel. However, I believe that the bracelet was changed afterwards, because even though it is a Rolex bracelet, signed bracelet, I believe that they came with two-tone bracelets as well. So I really haven't been able to find one where the gold bezel and then just kind of a stainless bracelet. However, again, you know, going down, that was my first purchase at the time too, and a bracelet's something that's easily swappable. So it was one of those things. No, I agree. And what I mean by that too is when people kind of dive into the whole vintage world, it's a scary place, because, you know, you're not really sure what's original and what's not. Yeah. And I always like to say, I guess my best advice is, people ask me all the time, hey, I want to buy a vintage piece. Like, what do I look out for? And the most important, everything, exactly. But besides the seller is like the dial is kind of like where the value is. And so if the dial is original and it's a very like unique or a one-off dial, such as in this case, like that's kind of why I was like, okay, like, you know what, even if the bracelet is not there, can always find an original one, but the dial and that case is really where you know, it was I wanted to make sure it was as it was at the time. So yeah, I mean, I love this piece. This is one that I would never sell. I mean, through the years, my collection's changed, but like this is always kind of like that aspirational piece. And yeah, it's kind of funny because as much as I like, you know, my watches that are, you know, anywhere from $400 to, let's say, any of the Rolexes that I have, I enjoy each one just the same. Mm-hmm. And so I think though at the time, and I think it's kind of instilled that like that Rolex purchase, like that aspirational, like,
Rolex
hey,
is Rolex.
I made it at the time, and you know, I was working really hard and at the time, and you know, I had a really good year. I'm in sales, and so anytime that I exceeded my goal and like I had an excuse to say like, hey, you know what, like it's kind of like a way to celebrate, you know, that's where this came about. So I, you know, it's always gonna hold a special place for me getting that first Rolex.
Well, and so I think it holds a special place for everybody, but I feel like what I'm seeing in the three watches and obviously the rest of these watches is, yeah, the uniqueness of everything, the very unique dial, the you know, more less known case sizes, and I mean, vintage being its own sort of thing. But I mean, I assume we're probably still at a price point where you could have gone out and got more mainstream models, or more, maybe not as you know, up to date, maybe date just for the price. But like, there are other watches that are modern, and so I mean, clearly vintage is what does it for you. But what is it about it? Is it that it's unique and special? Is it the history?
Yeah, I think it's, you know, it's a little bit of everything. I definitely like to see something that I haven't really seen a lot before. You know, I think too, the way I like to think of it is, if I go to, like, let's say a watch meetup and I see somebody with a table full of like something that I really haven't seen before, like, and then that will allow me to like walk up to them and strike a conversation. That's kind of like how I think about my collection as well, is like, hey, what's kind of a little bit out there? Like, yeah, I have some iconic pieces, but they're all just a little bit different than like the standard. And so I'm just kind of interested in something a little off the beaten path. Something that's just not the norm. Which I
like. And on that note, let's continue on. So you got the Rolex purchase, ticked that box. Some people could have maybe stopped there, but you clearly continued. And where'd we go from there?
Yeah, and then so from there, then I got this Clebar chronograph, and so this is interesting because kind of like growing up,
it looks familiar.
Yeah, exactly. But what kind of growing up, there's a little story is that when I was a kid, again, like around 10 to 12 years old, when when I was kind of getting into watches and all of that, and just like kind of love like having something on my wrist. I remember, you know, my family is from Italy originally. Yeah. My dad is from Italy, and we went back there to visit family, and I always was interested in a chronograph. I don't know why, and I never had a chronograph. It was just either kind of like a toy watch or just a time only. And ever since you know I was a kid, I remember like for some reason being enamored with chronographs. I just thought they would look cool. I don't even know if I would know how to use them at the time, of course, but thought it was so cool. And when I went back to Italy, we were at a flea market, and I remember seeing like a chronograph, and it was what I thought was affordable, very, very good price. And I begged my dad, like, hey, like, please, like, you know, I really want this like watch. And you know, I never really asked for anything on any of that trip. And so he bought it for me. And I think it was probably like $15 equivalent at the time. And so I remember I was just like in love with that chronograph. And a month later, as I'm wearing it literally every day for a month, one day I decided to, I don't know why, one day I just decided to start using the pushers. I don't know why I didn't try before, but you know, I think I was like 12 years old again at the time. And I tried to use the pushers, and I realized at that time that they weren't doing anything. And I quickly realized that all of the chronograph hands were stickers, because it was all fake.
No.
And so it's kind of funny because I never had a chronograph since then, and you can argue I never really had a chronograph to begin with.
That's too funny.
And so when I was kind of like looking for my next piece, I said, you know what, like I want to get my first chronograph, like legit one, so I had the Speedmaster, of course, and that is a chronograph, and that kind of went into there, but I was in love with Heuer, and like Heuer is iconic for their chronographs, and to me that was a kind of like that iconic like chronograph piece. And so I found out about this piece, you know, the Carreras at the time, Panda dials. I love the Panda dial, which is that black with the white dial. And the Carreras, you know, similarly, they were going for over $12,000, $11,000, and that was way out of my budget. And so I soon found out about what they call poor man Heuers. And so what these were, you know, Clebar, Zodiac, and Tradition. These were the brands. And in the 60s and the 70s, Heuer distributed these parts over to the U.S., but because of regulations at the time, they couldn't actually import the Swiss Heuers. So they actually sent over the parts, and these brands actually manufactured these watches off of those Heuer parts. And so this one is special because it's a Valjoux 72 movement, which is the same movement as the Rolex Daytona. And so in the chronograph world, it's like, you know, one of the most sought after movements, just because the spacing of the sub dials, and it just, the way it subtly just looks just so right. Like the design language is gorgeous. And so, that's how I ended up with this piece.
I have been interested in we'll call it tag Heuer at this point, because I don't know if I'm going back to Heuer, but I was very interested when it got released. I think it's their 40th anniversary, what they call the glass box. And it's very similar, I feel like, in a lot of design aspects to this, obviously, you know, it being in the same lineage. But I think Tag has done a good job of like kind of bringing themselves back. And so hopefully people will start to look at vintage ones all the same too.
So then, you know, I got into this. I really wanted a something different. So I had, you know, the black dial, I had the Panda dial, and I know I had the blue Mosaic, but I really wanted a diver. I kind of like, as I kind of was thinking about my collection, I kind of wanted something from, you know, different brands, as well as like, you know, different complications and different use functions. And so, you know, I was really looking for a nice dive watch, and I always loved the blue Tudor Sub. I really fell in love with this one because of that patinaed bezel. So usually they're a lot darker blue, and just kind of patina ever so slightly to this baby blue. And so this is a 1991, came on the bracelet, and I kind of did the naughty thing that a lot of people don't like leather on divers. I don't know, that's like a thing that ticks some people off, but I mean, nobody's really diving with these things anyway, right?
Nobody uses watches for anything either.
Exactly.
Nobody's actually timing things with chronographs.
Exactly. And so this is actually, if I'm saying it correctly, Valjoux
Oh,
strap as well.
Okay.
Yes. I know you guys were talking about that the other day too.
I don't know if he knew how to say it properly, but so he speaks very highly of them.
Yes.
I think he's bought a couple. And do you have any connections with them? I
know
we need to hit him up for a sponsorship.
No, I know that they're in Chicago. The quality is great. And so I actually got this custom made because I needed something smaller for my wrist. And a lot of these straps are a little bit longer. And I wanted the blue stitching to match the bezel as well. So like kind of, so now like they're basically married together, but also like I love that the tritium. You know, a lot of the modern kind of pieces they are made so that they don't age, and so I love it kind of going away from the ceramic bezels and the Superluminova loom. Like these bezels are gonna show age as you wear them and make memories with them. And the tritium, of course, also will break down and. It's already starting with this piece, and so it's kind of interesting to see how each one of these pieces ages differently. And we're talking about early 90s, and we're already kind of seeing like patina from that era, and it's pretty cool.
It's wild. Well, and so, I think everyone in the audience will know what a Submariner is. I mean, probably the most recognizable and most everyday Joe has a black date or no date sub, but this is definitely a unique thing. But you were showing me off screen too, and we have some footage of it, but that there are, a lot of people know that Tudor is attached to Rolex, right? The little sister, but, and obviously they would maybe share some parts, but I've never in person been able to see such a blatant, and throw a little bit of Rolex stuff on it too. Like, I know in car manufacturers it happens all the time, but like to see it have one logo in the center and then another logo on the crown is very strange.
It is crazy. At the time, so this was, I think they stopped doing it in the early 90s or maybe even the mid 90s. There you'll find that on all the vintage Tudor pieces before that time that they used the same case backs, bracelets, and crowns as Rolex. Yeah. So when you're actually, I actually needed to replace the crown on this 4 months ago, and it was a Rolex part number because it's a Rolex crown. Yeah. And so it's interesting on how they did that. I don't know if it was because of, I'm sure somebody in the comments probably knows, but maybe it was a surplus of parts. It was just easier to kind of hey, you know what? We already have these pieces instead of making their own. Or maybe it was also because, again, at that time too, Tudor has done a great job coming back with the Black Bay and kind of getting back in the public spotlight and really shines on their own. Yeah. But I feel like too, at that time, Tudor was kind of still seen so much as the entry to Rolex. It's the pathway to Rolex. And so maybe also having those Rolex pieces on there kind of helped sell some of the pieces. I don't know. It could be a mix of both of those things.
Well, and you definitely can see it. Again, I'm no historian on this sort of stuff, but the Mercedes hands, very Rolex. And I don't know if the snowflake hands on Tudors nowadays or more heritage stuff, or if it was later that they came out with that sort of stuff. But there are so many telltale Rolex things on this.
No, so the oldest subs, the older Tudor subs had the snowflake. Okay. So that was kind of like a harken back to, and that was always a very Tudor thing. Yeah. So that actually, everybody loves the snowflake. And so it was interesting. Yeah, with these subs, they went towards more of the Rolex look with the Mercedes. But yeah, it is a cool piece, and it's one of my favorites in the collection. Again, I just love the way that that's patinaed over the years. So
very cool. So where to next?
So throughout this time, I was also always kind of looking for a birth year watch, and so again, it's another thing that we tell ourselves to kind of one more purchase, right? Yeah. But so I was always looking for a birth year Rolex, and so I ended up kind of looking for probably 3 years for a birth year Pepsi. And again, kind of going off of the beaten path, like I didn't want a Submariner. I wanted something like a little bit different. I wanted a GMT. It was, again, another complication I didn't already have in my collection. Yeah. And I really wanted on a Jubilee. I always loved the Jubilee bracelet. And so the problem that I found is either if I found a birth year and it was perfect, it didn't have the Jubilee, or I found the perfect watch and then it wasn't the right year, or then I found the perfect everything and then it was way overpriced.
Sure,
so it took so long. And again, like, kind of retrospectively, it's like, you know what, maybe we get a little bit too caught up, and then maybe you should just buy the best watch at the time that, is the, affordable to you, and like that just ticks all those boxes. But I think I just really wanted that so bad, and I ended up finally finding the perfect piece after 3 years of just kind of keeping an eye out, where I found the Jubilee on the Pepsi at the right price, and I just had to pick it up. So when this came, so this, it was kind of like, it actually was around the holidays as well. So that was another telltale sign where I'm like, you know what, this is meant to be. So right around the holidays, my birthday is around the holidays as well. So it was kind of an easy decision to make at the time.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, and so I know, GMTs are like the most desirable Rolex model, I feel like. I don't know if that is supported by the numbers, and I assume that they don't make quite as many, but I mean, I know you can't try hard enough to get a Pepsi GMT at this point.
Yeah, no, it's crazy.
To have one is very unique and special. And then, as you said, the patina on the dial, or not the dial, but the bezel, is a very unique thing. And I don't know, I know Pan Am had was this in that time or after that time, or?
So this is the model is 16750, and so these started, I believe, in the mid to early 80s is when they came out with this model. Every generation had small differences, and the Pan Am, I believe, was the reference before this one. Okay. But like this one has the quick set date, and then it has the white gold around the markers. The year before that, there was no white gold around the markers, and it was just kind of flat, which is actually, and this is a glossy, and the previous ones are just matte. So it's kind of crazy. Like, but when you're gonna kind of delved into this world, you kind of need to know the differences between all of them, because like I said, you want to make sure that you're buying the right original piece. And actually, one thing interesting about this, I ended up getting this one off of eBay, and what I ended up finding out is, I was wearing it one day outside, and I went back in the house, and it was dark, and the lume lit up, and I said, this is not right, because 30 years later, there should be no lume, because it should be tritium. So what I ended up finding out, because a lot of the times what people used to do back then is they used to send the watch in for service, and Rolex would change out the dial. But interesting, and I was always kind of keen to make sure that I didn't buy a service dial. So what you'll see is the service dials on those older vintage Rolexes, even into the 90s, they just say Swiss on the bottom, whereas these actually show tritium. And then it has like the two markers on the side, and it says Swiss in the inside. So when you see Swiss, it's a service dial. But this one didn't have that. It actually has the full original, the way that it's supposed to be. But what I ended up finding out is that Rolex, on a certain amount of dials, they had the original kind of Swiss marking, but they changed the lume to Superluminova. Yeah. So this piece actually doesn't have tritium, and so it has Luminova. And while at the time I was like, like that kind of stinks, but then at the end of the day, like, one, it was, hey, you know what? It's kind of cool that it actually still like glows and actually serves a function.
I think that actually makes sense.
Yeah, and then at the end of the day, I realized like this is not something I'm gonna ever sell anyway. Yeah. And so I'm like, again, it took me so long to find the perfect piece, and I'm still incredibly happy. And at the end of the day, it's part of Rolex's story. Yeah. So, at least, it's something that they did. And if anything, it's kind of wacky that they did that, like without putting a service dial, and they changed the lumen.
It has its own little history to it. And I think with, from what little I know about vintage stuff, like you said, getting the specifics is so important, and there's so many things. And sometimes it's replace bracelets, replace this, and it's like at some point, it's minor stuff. It's like it looks the same. It lights up where it didn't light up before. It's like, you know, is that you're gonna let you walk away from a deal or sell it because it's not totally perfect? And as you said a little bit earlier, it's like perfection might be kind of tough to achieve, and watches of this time and getting that absolutely never been touched, but also never been worn, but also a good price. And
exactly.
like, you know, it's like
having to hit all
an
those
uphill battle.
It's having to hit all those markers. Through this time, I'd always been looking for a moon phase, and so I ended up coming across this 1949 Omega Cosmo. And so this is a triple calendar moon phase with a tropic moon phase. So that means that it's got that brown tone that's aged over time. And so this was originally a silver dial, and the patina just over time kind of turned into this custardy kind of gold dial. And, you know, it's interesting because for the longest time I knew about this watch, and I was like, you know what? For the price point, I thought this was a great bang for your buck, because I think we talked about earlier, like there's watches that are kind of in hot horology that kind of did very similar styles for that era, post World War II, when everybody was kind of creating all these different complications because all of a sudden the economies got better and whatnot. And I really, for the longest time, wanted to stay away from Omega, only because I already had Omegas in the collection, and I just kept seeing this piece, and finally, you know, I found one in great condition like this, where it's unpolished, and I couldn't let it go. And it's all completely serviced, and I know that becomes another trouble, you know, servicing a movement like that.
Yeah, trying to find people. Was it service? But you said you found a guy, but is it
so
like
this
Omega
one was already
no?
Okay, I found a guy, because even if you go to Omega, you know, some of these parts,
I'm good.
like some of these parts, I believe there was a part that needed to be tracked down from South America just to you know, one of these. And that's the thing about vintage, right? Good
luck, you know.
You know, it's kind of a little bit worrisome, because then you think like, hey, if we're not getting enough watchmakers into the industry, like if young people are not interested in doing that, a lot of these watchmakers, they're all kind of up there in age. Yeah. And it's like, well, it's going to be so hard to find people to work on, you know, watches kind of had a renaissance over the last few years. Yeah. But all of the content creators like yourself
making it easy.
Yeah.
To get entrapped.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's kind of a little worrisome, is like, you know, well, who's going to help keep these things alive, like in the future? And, you know, and some of the parts, they could be swapped from different movements that kind of are similar or whatnot. But finding like the watchmaker that actually is willing to like help you out with that, it's tough. It's already tough, and I can only imagine. But yeah, that's kind of what makes it special, though, is when you find the right one that everything's working and it ticks all the boxes.
Well, and speaking of ticking the boxes, when you sent me, you know, the list, the breakdown of what you were going to be bringing today, this would probably be one thing that I, you know, before you sent it to me would be like not on my interest, not on my radar, not looked at it at all. But then there was something so, I don't know, just I was pulled to it, and I think it's of the collection, definitely one of the cooler and more interesting pieces. And I said it off screen with you that, you know, as you were talking about getting into bigger complications and stuff like this, I assume pretty complicated watch here. Yeah. And I'm just baffled at how slim it is. Yeah. And I think most of the height from it at all is the acrylic or whatever.
So the reason why the acrylic is so thick on this one, it is higher. It seems like it's higher than the entire case, is because of the handset. So they said it's because of the handset, because it's stacked so many hands on top of each other, that the acrylic is so tall. But yeah, it's kind of amazing what they were able to do at that time to create something like, you know, in this kind of form factor with that kind of complication.
You know, one thing I did want to, I guess, question you on is, so I think with any luxury watch, you feel it on your wrist a little bit more, in the sense that you're like, I don't want to knock this into something. Yeah. I don't want to get scuffs if I don't have to. Not that you have to baby it, but do you feel that there's like an added pressure with vintage? Do you treat them the same, or do they mostly live in the watch box, or how do you kind of treat them?
It's a good question, because you know, one of the problems that I have is I feel like I need like a daily beater modern watch, because going on vacation, if it gets in contact with water, like obviously all of these are...
A heavy breeze might knock these things out, bro. A misty day.
But like, I've been to a wedding and someone spills a drink, and all of a sudden now I had a 1940s Movado and water got underneath the crystal, because a lot of these, the gaskets break down over time. And so, you have to be a little bit more worried about, obviously, like, water's huge. In the rain, not so much, because, for the most part, if I'm wearing a coat or long sleeves, But like, even in some of the more delicate pieces, so like this Omega, they didn't have any gaskets. And so that what's special about it is a lot of the dials corroded. And so this one is so clean because, again, didn't have gaskets, and a lot of people, it did see too much moisture. And so, but then again, that's what kind of makes it special in the long run, because now there's very few that...
It's just very counterintuitive for anyone that doesn't know this sort of stuff. Watches are strange, where sometimes the more fucked up it is, the better it is in the scheme of things.
So you have to be cognizant. They're also not sapphire glass for the most part. So if you knock it into a brick wall, you're going to get scratches, and there's ways to kind of buff them out. But a lot of these crystals, like for this Enicar, for example, this crystal is very specific to this. Some of these other watches, you can get a generic crystal where you just find the diameter. But the way that like this one specifically is that there's like a gasket that goes into this inner bezel that can turn here, and if that crystal cracks, you're basically kind of screwed. Because you're not going to be able to find an original crystal that's from the 1960s. And so, you have to be kind of cognizant of like, okay, don't get like, try not to knock your hands like wild. I know that's easier said than done, right? You don't know when you're doing something, that knocks around.
But you wear them, I guess is what I'm
getting
at.
I wear them. I rotate them all. I try to give them all kind of...
That's equal. Good. I like to try to... I have less watches, but I try to do the same thing. Where
otherwise, and for the most part, I like to think like that's good for the watches too, because again, they're staying kind of oiled up and whatnot and moving.
We have Omega on the table. Let's go to another one here.
This is a 1950s, I believe 1954 Omega Seamaster, Honeycomb dial.
54.
Yeah, and so if I don't know when they released it, but I know it's within the last year minimum, maybe the last couple of years. Omega just also released this same reissue, this kind of same case. It's actually, this one's a little bit different, but they have kind of a vintage inspired Seamaster. That's going for about 8 times the price of the vintage pieces. And so when we talk about, I think a lot of you hear this all the time, like the best value for money is a vintage like Omega, right? Especially these Seamasters, which they were, made for, I believe what the term is, land, town, and sea is like what they used to call the Seamaster. So because this is a watch that you can kind of could do everything. And again, this one's in gold. But if it was in stainless, even more so, like this is a watch that can be worn with a suit. You can wear it out on the water, kind of hit all of those things. And so, with this one, I was always looking for that Honeycomb dial. And what I like to do is when I travel somewhere overseas, I try to find, instead of like a souvenir, I try to find a watch that I could bring back that I can create memories with. And so I was recently in London in October, and I was like scouring. I mean, London has so much history, with horology. I mean, you see it in all the clocks everywhere, and of course Big Ben. And there's so many different watch vendors and vintage shops and antique shops, and it was amazing to kind of like see all of that. And I was kind of looking all over for a watch to bring back, and I couldn't find the right one. And trust me, I went through a lot of different. My wife can tell you, we went through a lot of different dealers. And on the last day, I was messaging somebody, kind of in bed on eBay, and I finally came across like the vintage Honeycomb watch that I've always looked for, and it came in the Seamaster variety. I was looking at Omegas, I was looking at Rolexes, and so when this one came up, I was like, oh man, this is awesome. And I messaged the guy, and wouldn't you believe he was in London? And so I was like, oh, this is like meant to be.
It is.
So we ended up like 5 hours before my flight. I met up with him at the train station, and I purchased it. Yeah. And I ended up purchasing it off-site because I was like, hey, I'm here right now. Like, maybe we could do a deal. And he was on his way to Parliament at the time.
Interesting.
And so now, that every time I wear that, I think of that trip. And, we went to Scotland and we toured all over England. And, I look forward to making memories with that. And so the last piece that I have here is the Cartier Santos. And so this watch is kind of, for whatever reason, the one where people walk up to me like, hey, I really like your watch. And this came out because I was kind of looking for something, with an integrated bracelet that's slim, that actually kind of fits my wrist, because a lot of the integrated bracelets, they're just kind of on bulkier, bigger watches. Yeah. And I kind of fell in love with the history that this is the first wristwatch ever made.
Which is cool bragging rights, man.
And so when it comes to a lot of these, you're right. A lot of people might not, they really don't notice a whole lot. What I've found is, especially in this case of the Santos, you're not attracting girls as some people might think, like or people of the opposite sex. It's usually watch nerds just coming up to you and dragging their like girlfriends or wives.
Look what he's got.
And they're like, look, this is the one that I was telling you about.
And it's it's too funny. I think I definitely, when I got into watches, I wasn't, thinking it was going to attract women. I was like, the dudes, it's cool enough if it's a conversation piece, but it is one of those things where you have a Ferrari up front, everyone's like, oh, look at that sick car, but like you could have a real heavy hitter of a piece. I mean, you could have just about anything, and 99% of the population is going to be like, that's a watch, cool,
exactly.
And they have no idea. But I guess, does that, part of it bother you, or is it like the guys that do know, it's even like more like, holy shit, like,
no, I kind of like just kind of being under the radar with it, and the people that know, they know. And one of the ways that I found out about like our local watch community here is I was wearing an Oris, and somebody walked up to me and said, hey, like, are you into watches? And I said, yeah. And he's like, there's like a meetup that happens XYZ every so often. I'm like, oh, this is awesome. And through that, I've met all kinds of friends. But again, it all started with like kind of wearing something that is, the average Joe's not gonna maybe have. And then that kind of sparks like this whole new like relationship with different people that are into something similar to you. And so I feel like all of these pieces kind of spark also that kind of interest in other.
When I found the watches more so than plenty of other things do kind of pull people together, because like people that are into watches, it's its own unique form of passion, I guess. And again, like a lot of people could be into cars, but watch guys are very funny. And as I was saying, we have people that come to the studio all the time, and it's like, I'm all like, I can see what they're wearing before they even do it. I'm like, what's the story with that? And they're like, you can just tell their face like lights up, and they're just so giddy, and they're like, finally, someone else, because they're, nobody, most days nobody's gonna say anything to you. And so
normally with the black bay, I've actually seen people out with the black bays, and always they're a watch guy, or they're like just getting into water. It's always somebody that's kind of on the pathway. And so like it's I'm on the search for a modern, like kind of like daily, where like, hey, if it's summer, hot outside, you don't want to get moisture into a vintage piece, or just like on a vacation, I'll be honest with you, I've been looking. I really like to stick at the 38 millimeter and below mark, and there's not a lot out there. True, And so what I did notice, though, like even some of the most recent watch trade shows, is that a lot of these, even the modern manufacturers, are starting to size things down.
Yeah, I agree.
What I noticed is, while I love 36 millimeter, one of the problems, and one of the watchmakers told me this, is that watch manufacturers told me that a lot of the movements aren't sized that small yet. So like a lot of the generic, because again, a lot of these independent companies, like just take the Swiss out of it. They're not, they're using these generic movements and they're not small enough to make smaller pieces. And so we have to wait then on maybe like some of the bigger Swiss brands to do something like that. Although I would like to support maybe a micro brand for like a daily kind of piece, like something that I don't have to worry about too much. But again, like I just hope that I find the right kind of piece that's within the right size for me. But become a daily. Well, I'm looking forward to you getting that. Is there anything in wrapping up about your collection and some sort of philosophy or little tidbit of advice you have for people that are interested in maybe getting into to vintage watches?
Yeah,
I mean, obviously buy what you love and don't get too caught up into like, hey, what other people like, or, how much patina is too much patina. I mean, it's really just kind of like how it makes you feel when you like kind of look at it. Again, for me personally, one of the things that I hate to see is because of this kind of renaissance of watches, a lot of dealers have kind of been really marking up prices like crazy. I recently just saw this morning a watch that sold for a vintage piece that sold for $12,000 within 3 days. That's that dealer that it's a kind of a big YouTuber as well. Sold it for tried to sell it for $23,000.
No big deal.
And just like within 2-3 days. And it was a big auction that sold for $12,000. So like everybody kind of knew like that what it was. And so this kind of like price gouging of vintage pieces, because really at the end of the day, it's like, hey, if you like this dial that's like patinaed in this specific way, so I think one of the ways too is like, okay, buy what you love, but also be cognizant of like, like when you might be getting gouged on a price.
The smallest details can make a massive price difference.
And while I know it's taboo to say like, I'm not buying watches as an investment. I think that if you buy correctly, all of these pieces have actually gone up in value. And that's kind of one of the cool perks about a vintage piece is that they've already kind of stabilized in their price. Whereas if you buy maybe outside of Rolex, if you buy like a new Omega or a Panerai, they're dropping like 40%. And so like, it's just kind of like an extra perk. If like, hey, you buy the right seller and make sure that you're getting a fair price. Because a lot of the dealers out there, they are trying to take advantage, especially even on the vintage bracelets. They're like selling them for 4 or 5 times the price as well. So just be cognizant and inform yourself and do research so you know what you're getting into.
I think that is wonderful advice. Well, Nino, this has been a stellar episode that I didn't think was probably going to happen so quickly about with such a vintage thing. And I can't appreciate you enough for bringing so much out and sitting down and having a conversation with me, man. So I really appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to seeing the rest of your watch journey.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.